The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting a warm orange glow over the small town of Red Rock. At the edge of town stood a humble animal shelter, its faded sign swaying gently in the breeze. Inside, the air was filled with the echo of barking dogs and the occasional meow of a cat. Rows of kennels lined the concrete walls, each holding a story of abandonment, hope, or heartbreak. Eric Turner, a young mechanic with grease-stained hands and a heart of gold, walked through the door. The bell above chimed softly, and a tired-looking worker greeted him with a polite nod. "Looking for a pet?" she asked, her tone warm but weary. Eric shrugged. "Not really," he said. "But I've been thinking about it. Just wanted to see if someone here fits." The worker, whose name tag read Tina, gestured toward the kennels. "Take your time," she said. "But fair warning, most of these dogs have seen rough times. They're not exactly easy cases." As Eric wandered past the cages, some dogs wagged their tails, pressing against the bars with hopeful eyes. Others cowered in the corners, wary of another human who might fail them. Then, in the farthest kennel, Eric noticed a dog unlike the rest, a scruffy mutt with coarse black fur and striking blue eyes. "What's his story?" Eric asked, kneeling to get a closer look. The dog flinched, his body trembling as he pressed himself against the wall. Tina hesitated. "That's Shadow," she said. "He's been here the longest. No one wants him. Severe anxiety, doesn't trust anyone. Honestly, we've talked about whether it's humane to keep him here at all." Eric's heart ached at the sight of the trembling dog. He thought about the times he'd felt invisible, unwanted, like the world had no place for him. "What happened to him?" he asked softly. Tina sighed, her gaze softening. "We don't know everything. He was found as a stray, scared out of his mind. We think he might have been abused. Most people don't want to deal with a dog like him. They want one that's already perfect." Eric looked at Shadow again, his blue eyes filled with a mix of fear and longing. "I'll take him," he said firmly. Tina's eyes widened. "Are you sure? He's not like the others. He'll need a lot of work, time, patience, and, well, love." Eric nodded. "No one's perfect," he said. "Not him, not me. But maybe we can help each other." Despite Tina's hesitation, Eric filled out the adoption paperwork. As he signed the final line, he glanced at Shadow, who still hadn't moved from the corner of his kennel. "I won't give up on you," Eric whispered, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out together." Eric carefully loaded Shadow into the back seat of his old pickup truck, the dog trembling the entire time. Despite Eric's gentle reassurances, Shadow refused to meet his eyes. His body stiff with fear. The drive home was quiet except for the sound of Shadow's shallow breaths and the occasional rustle as he shifted in the seat. When they arrived at Eric's modest home on the outskirts of Red Rock, he opened the door and crouched down to Shadow's level. "Come on, buddy," he said softly. "This is your home now." Shadow hesitated, his paws frozen at the edge of the seat. With a deep sigh, Eric reached in, carefully lifting the dog out of the truck. Shadow didn't resist, but his body remained rigid, his blue eyes darting nervously around the unfamiliar surroundings. Inside the house, Eric had prepared a cozy corner with a soft bed, toys, and a bowl of fresh water. "This is all yours," he said, gesturing toward the setup. Shadow stayed near the door, his tail tucked between his legs. The first few days were a test of Eric's patience and Shadow's trust. The dog avoided him at every turn, refusing food if Eric was in the room and retreating to his corner whenever he approached. Eric spent hours sitting on the floor nearby, talking to Shadow in a calm voice. "I get it," Eric said one evening, his back against the wall as Shadow lay curled up in his bed. "Life's been rough. You don't know who you can trust. But I'm not going anywhere." Progress was painfully slow. Shadow remained wary, flinching at sudden movements and loud noises. He wouldn't play with the toys or wag his tail. And the sight of his untouched food bowls began to weigh on Eric's heart. Determined to break through, Eric decided to take Shadow outside. He attached a leash to the dog's collar, half expecting resistance, but Shadow followed him reluctantly into the yard. The open space seemed to ease some of the tension in Shadow's body, though he stayed close to Eric's side. "That's it," Eric said, a small smile breaking across his face. "You're doing great." One morning, about a week after bringing Shadow home, Eric woke to an unexpected sight. Shadow was sitting at the edge of his bed, his blue eyes watching him intently. It was the first time the dog had voluntarily approached him. "Hey, buddy," Eric said softly, not wanting to scare him away. He reached out his hand, holding it still a few inches away. Shadow sniffed it cautiously before taking a tentative step closer. Eric's heart swelled with hope. "There you go. See? We're figuring this out." The breakthrough gave Eric a renewed sense of purpose. He started introducing Shadow to small, positive experiences: a short walk around the block, a treat given with a gentle word, an evening spent watching TV with Shadow lying nearby. Though the dog remained cautious, he began to show signs of curiosity and trust. One evening, as Eric sat on the porch watching the sunset, Shadow walked up to him and rested his head on Eric's knee. The gesture was simple, but it brought tears to Eric's eyes. "You're starting to believe in me, huh?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." But the road ahead was still long. Shadow's fear wasn't something that could be erased overnight. He startled easily, barked nervously at strangers, and still retreated to his corner when overwhelmed. Yet, with each small victory, Eric's resolve grew stronger. For the first time in years, both man and dog had found something they hadn't realized they were searching for: a chance to heal. Weeks turned into months, and Shadow's progress continued, albeit slowly. Eric's patience and persistence began to pay off in small but significant ways. Shadow no longer flinched at every sound, and his tail started wagging, hesitantly at first, but more freely as time passed. One sunny morning, Eric decided it was time to take Shadow to the park. The thought made him nervous. Shadow's anxiety around strangers and new environments had been a persistent challenge, but Eric believed they were ready for the next step. He packed a small bag with treats, water, and Shadow's favorite blanket, then clipped the leash onto the dog's collar. "You'll do great," Eric said, kneeling beside him. "And if it gets too much, we'll come right back. Promise." Shadow looked up at Eric, his blue eyes filled with cautious trust. The park was quiet when they arrived. The early hour keeping the usual crowds at bay. Eric led Shadow to a shaded area under a tree, spreading out the blanket and sitting down. Shadow stayed close, his body tense but not trembling as it once had. "See? Not so bad," Eric said, offering a treat. Shadow took it, his tail wagging faintly. As the morning wore on, more people arrived. Joggers passed by, children played on the swings, and other dogs roamed the grassy fields. Shadow watched everything with wide eyes, his ears twitching at every sound. The real test came when a golden retriever trotted over, its owner following close behind. The dog barked playfully, wagging its tail as it approached Shadow. Eric tensed, ready to step in if Shadow panicked. But to his surprise, Shadow didn't shy away. Instead, he stood still, his tail wagging ever so slightly. "That's Shadow," Eric said, smiling at the golden retriever's owner. "He's still learning to trust, but this is a big deal for him." The woman nodded, her face kind. "He's beautiful. You're doing something amazing, you know." Eric glanced at Shadow, who was cautiously sniffing the golden retriever. "He's the amazing one," he said. "I'm just lucky to know him." The encounter was brief, but it marked a turning point for Shadow. Over the next few days, he seemed more confident, his movements less hesitant and his demeanor brighter. He started exploring the yard on his own, sniffing the flowers and chasing the occasional butterfly. One evening, as Eric worked on his truck in the driveway, Shadow trotted over and sat beside him, his tail wagging. "You're getting the hang of this, aren't you?" Eric said, scratching behind Shadow's ears. For the first time, Shadow leaned into Eric's touch, letting out a contented sigh, but their progress wasn't without setbacks. On a trip to the vet for a routine checkup, Shadow froze at the sight of the crowded waiting room. His body trembled, and he pulled against the leash, trying to retreat. "It's okay, buddy," Eric said, kneeling down to comfort him. "We'll get through this together." Eric asked the staff if they could wait outside until it was their turn. The fresh air helped calm Shadow. And by the time they were called in, he was able to walk into the exam room without panic. "That's my boy," Eric whispered, his pride evident. The experience reinforced Eric's commitment to Shadow's well-being. He began incorporating more exposure training into their routine, short trips to new places, meeting friendly neighbors, and even inviting a few close friends over to the house. Each challenge was met with patience and encouragement, and Shadow continued to surprise Eric with his resilience. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Shadow climbed onto Eric's lap and licked his face, a gesture of affection that Eric hadn't expected but deeply cherished. "You're not just my dog," Eric said softly, stroking Shadow's fur. "You're my family." For the first time in years, Eric felt a sense of purpose and connection that had been missing from his life. And for Shadow, the dog no one wanted, the world was finally starting to feel safe. Eric and Shadow's bond grew stronger with each passing day. Shadow, once timid and fearful, now approached life with a cautious but growing confidence. The transformation didn't go unnoticed by the people around them. Neighbors who had seen Eric walking Shadow began to stop and admire the dog, their kind words and encouragement sparking hope for both man and canine. One morning, as Eric walked Shadow through the neighborhood, they passed a small group of children playing on the sidewalk. One of them, a boy no older than 7, pointed at Shadow and exclaimed, "Look at his eyes. They're so cool." Eric smiled, crouching to Shadow's level. "This is Shadow," he said. "He's a little shy, but he's friendly." The boy approached cautiously, holding out his hand. Shadow sniffed it and wagged his tail, tentatively at first, but then more confidently. The children giggled, taking turns petting him as Shadow leaned into their touch. For Eric, the moment was monumental. Shadow was no longer just surviving, he was thriving. Encouraged by Shadow's progress, Eric decided to take him to a community dog training class. The class was held in a nearby park and focused on building trust and confidence between dogs and their owners. Shadow was nervous at first, his body tense as they approached the group of dogs and their handlers. "It's okay, buddy," Eric said, kneeling beside him. "We're in this together." The trainer, a woman named Janet, approached with a warm smile. "Shadow's beautiful," she said. "What's his story?" Eric hesitated before answering. "He had a rough start," he said. "But he's come a long way." "Well, you're in the right place," Janet said. "Let's see what he can do." The class began with basic commands and trust-building exercises. At first, Shadow was hesitant, his anxiety flaring at the sight of the other dogs. But with Eric's patience and encouragement, he began to participate. By the end of the session, Shadow had mastered sit and stay, earning cheers from the group. "You're a natural," Janet said as she handed Eric a certificate of completion at the end of the course. "Keep up the great work." Eric glanced at Shadow, pride swelling in his chest. "He's the one doing all the work," he said with a grin. Word of Shadow's transformation spread through the town. Neighbors began stopping by to ask about him, sharing their own stories of rescue animals and offering support. A local journalist even wrote an article about Shadow for the town newspaper, calling him the dog who proved everyone wrong. Shadow's story resonated deeply with the community. People who had once overlooked him began to see him as a symbol of resilience and love. One day, Tina, the shelter worker who had been hesitant to let Eric adopt Shadow, stopped by to check on them. She was amazed at the dog's progress, his wagging tail and bright eyes a far cry from the trembling animal she had known. "I never thought I'd see this," Tina said, kneeling to pet Shadow. "You've done something incredible." Eric shook his head. "He did it," he said. "He just needed someone to believe in him." The bond between Eric and Shadow became an inspiration, not just to the community but to Eric himself. For years, Eric had felt adrift, unsure of his place in the world. But in caring for Shadow, he found a purpose, a reason to get up every morning and face the day. "You saved me as much as I saved you," Eric said one evening as they sat on the porch. Shadow rested his head on Eric's lap, his blue eyes filled with quiet devotion. The once lonely mechanic and the dog no one wanted had become an inseparable pair. Together, they had built a life filled with trust, love, and the kind of hope that could weather any storm. But their journey wasn't over. There were still challenges to face and new milestones to reach. And Eric knew that, with Shadow by his side, they could handle whatever came their way. Life with Shadow had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. The once fearful dog now enjoyed daily walks, playful moments in the yard, and quiet evenings curled up beside Eric on the couch. But just as they were beginning to feel secure, a sudden challenge threatened to undo everything they had worked so hard to build. One crisp autumn morning, Eric noticed something off about Shadow. The dog, usually eager for their morning walk, lay lethargically on his bed, his ears drooping and his tail still. Concerned, Eric crouched beside him, gently scratching behind his ears. "You okay, buddy?" he asked softly. Shadow didn't respond the way he usually did. Instead, he let out a low whine and shifted uncomfortably. Eric's chest tightened. "We're going to the vet," he said, grabbing his keys. At the clinic, Shadow was quiet as the vet examined him, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. After running some tests, she pulled Eric aside, her tone gentle but firm. "Shadow has an infection," she said. "It's treatable, but he's going to need medication and a lot of rest. We caught it early, so that's a good sign." Eric nodded, relief mingling with worry. "Whatever he needs," he said. "I'll do it." The next few weeks were a test of both Shadow's resilience and Eric's dedication. Administering the medication wasn't easy. Shadow, ever cautious, resisted the pills at first. But Eric's patience won out, and soon Shadow began to trust the process. Despite the challenges, Eric stayed positive. "We've been through worse," he said one evening as he sat beside Shadow, stroking his fur. "You're the strongest dog I know. We'll get through this." As Shadow's health slowly improved, the bond between him and Eric grew even stronger. Shadow, who had once been too fearful to let anyone near him, now leaned on Eric both physically and emotionally. And Eric, who had once doubted his ability to care for another being, found himself drawing strength from their shared journey. "You're not just my dog," Eric said one night as Shadow rested his head on his lap. "You're my best friend." News of Shadow's illness spread through the community, and neighbors began to rally around Eric and his dog. Tina from the shelter stopped by with a care package, filled with treats and toys to lift Shadow's spirits. "He's lucky to have you," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I'm the lucky one," Eric replied, smiling as Shadow wagged his tail faintly. "He's taught me more than I ever thought possible." Shadow's recovery became a turning point not just for him, but for Eric as well. The experience deepened their bond and reminded Eric of the fragility and resilience of life. Shadow, true to his nature, faced his challenges with quiet strength, inspiring everyone around him. As the weeks turned into months, Shadow regained his energy. His tail wagged with its old enthusiasm, and his blue eyes sparkled with a renewed sense of joy. The dog no one wanted had proven, once again, that love and patience could overcome even the toughest obstacles. One evening, as Eric and Shadow walked through the neighborhood, they passed a group of children playing in a park. One of the kids ran up to Shadow, laughing as the dog licked his hand. "Your dog is amazing," the boy exclaimed. Eric smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Yeah," he said, looking down at Shadow. "He really is." The journey hadn't been easy, but every step had been worth it. Shadow's transformation, from a dog too scared to trust to a loyal and loving companion, was a testament to the power of second chances. And for Eric, the experience had been nothing short of life-changing. "I don't know where I'd be without you," Eric said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Shadow leaned into him, his tail wagging softly. In that moment, there was no doubt in Eric's mind they had saved each other. The crisp air of winter settled over Red Rock, but for Eric and Shadow, life had never felt warmer. Shadow, now fully recovered, moved through the world with a quiet confidence that no one could have imagined when Eric first brought him home. The dog who had once trembled in fear was now a beacon of resilience and love. One snowy afternoon, Eric decided to take Shadow to the park. The open field, blanketed in white, seemed to energize Shadow, who bounded through the snow with a playful spirit. Children and other dogs joined in, and Eric watched with a mixture of pride and awe as Shadow wagged his tail and barked joyfully. "You've come so far," Eric murmured, tossing a stick for Shadow to chase. "You're incredible, you know that." Shadow returned with the stick, his blue eyes shining as he dropped it at Eric's feet. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes about their journey together. Shadow's transformation continued to inspire the community. Tina from the shelter invited Eric and Shadow to speak at an adoption event, hoping their story would encourage others to give overlooked animals a chance. Standing in front of a small crowd, Eric shared Shadow's story, the fear, the challenges, and the triumphs. "Shadow wasn't the perfect dog," he said, his voice steady. "But he was the perfect dog for me. All he needed was someone to believe in him." The audience applauded, their faces filled with admiration. After the event, several families approached Eric, expressing their intent to adopt. "Your story reminded us that every animal deserves a chance," one woman said, her hand resting on the head of a shy, trembling dog she had just adopted. Eric smiled, glancing down at Shadow. That's all he ever needed. Shadow became a symbol of second chances in Red Rock. People who had once overlooked shelter dogs began to see them in a new light. Inspired by Shadow's journey, the shelter saw an increase in adoptions, and Tina often credited Shadow for the change. "We used to have dogs waiting for months," she said during one visit. "Now, they're finding homes so much faster." Shadow's story gave people hope. As the seasons changed, so did Eric and Shadow. Their bond deepened with each passing day, and the small moments, morning walks, evenings by the fire, and the occasional playful romp in the yard, became the foundation of a life filled with love and purpose. One evening, as Eric sat on the porch with Shadow by his side, he reflected on how much his life had changed. "I thought I was saving you," he said softly, stroking Shadow's fur. "But you saved me, too." Shadow wagged his tail, his blue eyes glowing in the light of the setting sun. It was as if he understood every word. Years later, Shadow's story remained a cherished memory in Red Rock. Eric, now volunteering at the shelter, often shared their journey with new adopters, encouraging them to look beyond a dog's fears or flaws. "Every dog has a story," he would say. "And sometimes, the ones who seem the hardest to love are the ones who end up teaching you the most." One day, as Eric walked through the shelter, he noticed a trembling dog in the corner of a kennel, small, scared, and unsure. His heart ached at the sight, and he thought of Shadow, the dog who had changed everything. Kneeling in front of the kennel, Eric smiled softly. "Hey there," he said. "You remind me of someone I used to know." The dog's tail wagged faintly, and Eric knew his story with Shadow had come full circle. Shadow, the dog no one wanted, had left a legacy of love, resilience, and hope. His journey with Eric was more than just a story, it was a testament to the power of compassion and the incredible bond between a man and his dog. And as the snow fell softly over Red Rock, Eric and Shadow's story continued to inspire, proving that every life, no matter how broken, is worth saving.